James Dalton stepped off the dusty Greyhound bus with nothing more than a canvas duffel, a faded Army-issued jacket, and a look in his eyes that said more than words ever could. The wind was dry, carrying the scent of mesquite and saddle leather, and the familiar stretch of rock ridge looked exactly the same as when he left it 7 years ago. Quiet streets, wide open land, and a sky too big to hide under. Except now, James wasn't the same man. War had a way of taking parts of you, sometimes the parts you didn't even realize you needed. He didn't expect a welcome party. He wasn't that naive. The town of Rockridge had always been small, and the people even smaller, in some ways friendly. Enough on the surface but sharp beneath if you didn't fit neatly into their expectations. And James, with his haunted eyes and a subtle limp that never fully healed, didn't quite fit anymore. The Double R Ranch sat 10 miles outside of town, nestled between low hills and dry brush. It was the kind of place that hired hands without too many questions as long as you showed up early, worked hard, and didn't cause trouble. That suited James just fine. He didn't need sympathy, or stories, or second chances. He just needed work. Dirt, sweat, and time. He figured those were the things that might ground him again. When he arrived at the ranch gates, he was met by a wiry old foreman named Hal, who gave him a once-over and a grunt that passed for approval. "You, the Army guy?" Hal asked, chewing on a toothpick. James gave a slow nod. "I served. Just looking for a place to work." Hal stared a moment longer before jerking his thumb toward the bunkhouse. "Rooms open. We start at 5. That was the extent of the welcome. No questions about rank or service. No curiosity about what happened over there. James was relieved, but the silence didn't last long. It wasn't that the ranch hands were cruel, not at first, just cautious. They noticed his limp when he moved across uneven ground. They saw how he froze for a second too long when a gate slammed shut or when a dog barked too loud. They noticed how he didn't join the others after supper, how he avoided eye contact, how his bed was always made with military precision. Corners tucked like he was still waiting for inspection. A few whispered behind his back. Nothing too loud, just words like shell-shocked or half there. One man laughed that James looked like someone who'd seen ghosts and started talking to cattle, just to feel normal. James ignored it. He knew better than to waste breath trying to explain himself to people who'd never worn body armor or counted heartbeats in silence behind a crumbling wall. Every day, he showed up on time. He worked longer than most, never complained, and kept his head down. The cattle didn't care if he'd served 2 tours. The horses responded to calm hands, not to medals. Out there in the fields, surrounded by nothing but sky and dirt, James felt the closest to peace he'd known since returning stateside. But in the bunkhouse, things were different. The younger hands joked that he was Sergeant Slow, poking fun at his limp or the way he double-checked every latch, every lock, like he expected something to explode. One time, someone moved his duffel and laughed when James flinched. Another time, they pretended to fire a cap gun behind him just to see what would happen. He didn't flinch that time. He simply walked outside, stood still for a long while, and returned without a word. No one asked about the scars on his shoulder or the photo he kept tucked inside his Bible and old snapshot of a dusty squad. All smiles, with only 2 still alive. No one knew about the bronze star folded in his jacket pocket, or the medal recommendation that had been sitting in bureaucratic limbo for years. And he didn't offer it up, not because he was ashamed, but because it didn't matter to them. Not yet. To them, he was just another drifter with a stiff leg and a 1,000-yard stare. To them, he was the man who came home, but never really returned. But that was about to change. The days at the Double R Ranch began early and ended late. Sunrise bled across the sky like fire, and with it came the clang of metal gates, the grunts of livestock, and the rhythm of boots scuffing along dirt paths. James Dalton learned quickly that on this ranch, being invisible was almost worse than being disliked. He didn't need to be welcomed. He'd stopped hoping for that years ago, but the isolation still wore thin. The other hands had their own rhythm, their own language of quick jokes and old stories traded across the saddle or over coffee at dawn. James wasn't part of it. He was the outsider, the one they didn't know how to place. He never raised his voice, never offered an opinion unless asked, and he kept to himself during meals. They assumed he was cold, maybe arrogant. But the truth was, simpler. James had spent so long in survival mode that small talk felt foreign, even risky. He didn't know how to join in without wondering what it would cost. When it came to work, James pulled his weight. He might have moved slower than the rest, but he was deliberate, never careless, never lazy. He repaired a stubborn fence gate without being told, reshoed a nervous mare that others wouldn't touch, and knew how to back a trailer with precision none of them could match. But effort wasn't always enough. "Be sure you were a soldier?" one of the younger cowboys, Kyle, asked with a laugh one morning as James adjusted a saddle in the barn. "Ain't you supposed to be tough or something?" James didn't look up. "Tough doesn't mean loud." That was all he said. But the comment spread quickly. Soon, tough became another joke muttered around the fire pit. Another barb casually tossed his way, as if his silence made him fair game. They called him Sergeant Slow when he wasn't within earshot, teased that he was too gentle to be of use, too damaged to handle real pressure. The foreman, Hal, didn't step in. He was old school, believed that respect was earned, not given. If James couldn't command it himself, then that was that. Still, Hal watched him closely. He saw something in the way James never snapped back, never pushed, never folded. It wasn't weakness, it was something else. But Hal, like the others, didn't know how to name it. Lily, the ranch cook, was one of the few who looked beyond the surface. She noticed how James ate slowly, always finished last, and never took more than he needed. She began setting aside a little extra for him, an extra biscuit, a second spoonful of beans, without saying a word. James nodded once in thanks, when he noticed, and that was the start of something small but real. She didn't ask about the army, he didn't offer, but in that quiet understanding, he felt something rare, safety. Still, the days dragged. Every sunrise brought more of the same unspoken judgments, whispered jokes, and a sense that no matter what he did, it wouldn't be enough to change their minds. And so James kept his head down and his hands busy. He repaired the fences, no one else had time for. He mucked the stalls without complaint. He patched broken irrigation pipes in the heat without waiting to be asked. But it wasn't pride that kept him going, it was survival. The ranch was the only place he'd found that offered structure without scrutiny, work without pity. Even if the men never saw him as more than a limping ghost in army green, the land didn't care, the cattle didn't judge. The mountains stood unmoved, silent and strong, like he wanted to be. Sometimes while working the back pastures, James would pause and look out across the open fields. In the silence, broken only by the wind and the rustle of dry grass, he felt echoes of himself, what he had been, what he might still be. For a few minutes each day, he could breathe. But back at the bunkhouse, the silence turned hostile again. Every gesture was misread, every word weighed. No one knew that James still woke up drenched in sweat from dreams he couldn't escape. No one knew the story behind the thin scar on his jaw, or the reason he flinched when someone touched his shoulder. Unexpectedly, they only saw the limp, the slowness, the quiet. And in a place where toughness was measured by volume and swagger, James Dalton was losing the only war he hadn't trained for, the war of perception. But something was building, just beneath the surface. And soon, the same people who doubted him would see just how wrong they had been. From the outside, James Dalton looked like a quiet man who kept to himself. But what the ranch hands didn't know, what they couldn't begin to imagine, was that beneath his silence raged a storm that never quite let up. Every night when the others snored in their bunks or swapped stories by the fire pit, James lay in his narrow bed staring at the ceiling, reliving the moments he tried so hard to forget. His body was in Rockridge, but pieces of his mind were still on a cracked desert road halfway across the world. Soaked in dust and blood, sleep came in fragments, rare, broken, and often worse than staying awake. The dreams weren't always violent. Sometimes they were deceptively calm, the sound of a convoy rumbling in the distance, the sharp chirp of a radio, the feel of sweat dripping down his neck as he crouched behind a Humvee. But then the moment would turn. A scream, a blast, fire, and James would jerk awake, heart pounding, shirt clinging to his chest. Most nights he didn't sleep at all. He'd rise quietly before dawn, long before the others stirred, and walk the edge of the ranch with a flashlight in one hand and his mind somewhere else. These early walks weren't just habit, they were survival. Moving helped, breathing helped, and being alone, out under the sky where there were no expectations, no glances, no whispered judgments. That helped most of all. The worst part wasn't the pain in his leg or the stiffness in his back. It was the way people looked at him, like he was broken, or worse, like he was dangerous. They didn't understand that he wasn't afraid of them. He was afraid of what might happen if the dam inside him cracked wide open. During the day, he did what he could to hold that dam shut. Every movement was calculated. Every word was measured. The ranch gave him a framework, a strict, familiar rhythm that echoed military routine. Feed, fix, clean, repair, repeat. The predictability was a bomb, and the physical labor helped ease the mental burden. But sometimes, it wasn't enough. One afternoon a truck backfired near the stables. The sudden sound echoed like a mortar blast, and James dropped instantly, his hands covering his head before his mind even caught up to his body. A few of the younger ranch hands saw it and laughed, thinking it was a joke, some kind of overreaction. James stood up slowly, dusted himself off, and said nothing. But that night, he didn't come to dinner. Lily noticed. She always did. She wasn't young, but she wasn't old, either, mid-40s maybe, with the quiet steadiness of someone who'd seen her share of hard days. She didn't pry, didn't hover, and never asked about the war. But she had a way of knowing what people needed without being told. With James, she gave space, but offered quiet kindness, an extra piece of cornbread wrapped in a napkin, or a thermos of coffee handed over without a word. Once, she found him kneeling by the horse corral, shoulders tense, eyes distant. "You all right?" she asked softly. James didn't answer for a long moment. Then he looked at her not quite directly and said, "Yeah, just remembering something that won't go away." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Well, you're not the only one out here with ghosts." It was the most personal thing either of them had said to one another, and it changed something subtle but real. After that day, James found himself lingering a little longer in the kitchen, sometimes just to be near someone who didn't treat him like a problem to solve or a warning sign to avoid. He didn't know if the others would ever see the full picture, if they'd ever understand the strength it took to keep showing up when your mind was a battlefield and your soul was stitched together with silence. But Lily saw more than most, and that, for now, was enough. He kept working, kept waking early, and moving through the pain. He repaired fences, saddled horses, drove cattle through the hills with a kind of quiet precision that, over time, some of the ranch hands began to respect, though none would admit it aloud. They still called him Sergeant Slow behind his back, but occasionally, they followed his lead when a horse spooked or a gate came loose. Something was shifting slowly, invisibly. James didn't push it. He just kept going. That's what he'd been trained to do. But the storm inside him was not done, and the ranch wasn't due with him yet either. It happened on a blistering afternoon in early July. The sun was merciless, baking the hills until the earth cracked and the sweat from the horses turned to salt before it could dry. The cattle were restless, kicking up dust and lowing anxiously. In the heat, tempers among the ranch hands were short, and even Hal, the foreman, barked his orders with less patience than usual. Everyone was tired, but no one more than James. That morning, Kyle, the loudest of the younger ranch hands, had already picked at James twice. First, over a coiled rope left hanging wrong on the fence post. Then, over the way James fed the horses in what Kyle called army order. James didn't respond either time. He just did his work, checked his tack, and moved on. That's what he always did, but Kyle wasn't the type to let quiet lie. By late afternoon, the crew was gathering strays in the lower pasture, a dry, rugged slope where footing was uneven, and the heat bounced off the rocks like fire. James moved steadily, using his horse with quiet skill, flanking cattle and guiding them up toward the pen. Kyle was nearby, shouting at his horse, kicking dust, and trying too hard to look like a cowboy out of a movie. And then it happened. A calf broke loose from the herd and bolted down a narrow ravine. James, being closest, nudged his horse into motion. The ground was tricky, but he kept low in the saddle, eyes locked on the runaway. Kyle saw it, too, and spurred his horse in fast from the side, angling to beat James there. His horse clipped a rock and stumbled just as James closed in. James reached down from the saddle, roped the calf clean, and leaned back in his stirrups to keep the little one from tumbling deeper. It was a practiced move, quick, clean, calm. Kyle, now furious, pulled up and dismounted in a storm of dust. "You just had to show me up, didn't you?" he spat, eyes flashing. James said nothing. He was still holding the rope, calming the calf. Kyle stalked closer. "You think you're better than the rest of us, just 'cause you were in the army." That made James look up. "I don't think I'm better," he said quietly. "I just do the job." Maybe it was the heat, or the frustration, or years of something unspoken boiling beneath Kyle's skin, but the next thing he did caught everyone off guard. He shoved James hard. The move might have knocked someone else down, but James had been trained for worse. He didn't stumble, didn't flinch. He just took a breath, deep, measured, and said, "Don't do that again." But Kyle wasn't finished. "You think you're some kind of hero," he sneered. "You're just a broken-down vet, hiding on a ranch because nobody else wants you." That cut deeper than any shove ever could. The rest of the crew had gone quiet. Even Hal had stopped mid-ride at the top of the hill, watching with unreadable eyes. James stared at the ground for a moment, jaw tight. He didn't yell, didn't swing. He simply coiled the rope, handed it off to another ranch hand, and walked away straight back toward the barn, head high but heart heavier than ever. That night, he didn't show up for supper. He didn't sit in the mess hall, didn't drink Lily's strong coffee, didn't say a word. He sat alone outside the bunkhouse, staring out toward the hills as the sun went down, his silhouette carved into the fading gold of the horizon. No one approached him, not even Kyle, but the moment didn't pass unnoticed. But Hal, who rarely got involved in the personal squabbles of his men, made a quiet note to himself. And Lily, watching from the kitchen window, sighed softly and wiped her hands on her apron. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed. James had held his ground without lifting a fist, and somehow, that made a louder statement than if he had. But the shame lingered, not because James believed Kyle's words, but because, deep down, part of him feared they might be true. Was this what he had come back to? A life where people saw only the limp and not the man. He didn't know it yet, but this low point, this moment of humiliation and silence was the turning point, because the world beyond the ranch was about to take notice, and everything was going to change. Days passed. James returned to his routine, though something had gone quieter in him, if that was even possible. The teasing at the ranch had eased slightly after the incident with Kyle, not out of guilt, but from discomfort. The hands avoided eye contact when James passed. Kyle kept his distance, and the others spoke less when James was nearby. Even Hal seemed more watchful, though he offered no words. It was Lily who broke the silence again. Late one evening, she knocked gently on the bunkhouse door and held out a plain manila envelope. Mail came. "This one's for you." Her voice was neutral, but there was something in her eyes, curiosity, maybe, or concern. James looked at the envelope. His name was typed clean across the front, along with a return address that sent a jolt through his chest. Department of the Army Office of Veteran Recognition, Washington, D.C. His hands hesitated. Then, with a nod of thanks, he accepted it and closed the door. For a long while, he just stared at it. He sat on his bunk in the dim light of the bare bulb overhead, the envelope untouched in his lap. He'd seen hundreds like it before, some bearing bad news, others too wrapped in ceremony to mean much. But this one was unexpected. Finally he tore it open. Inside was a letter on crisp official stationery. The words were direct, bureaucratic, and yet, somehow, deeply personal. Asterisk, Staff Sergeant James Dalton, on behalf of the Department of the Army, we are pleased to inform you that after a formal review of your service record and actions during Operation Iron Ridge, the committee has recommended you for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military award for valor. Your leadership under fire, commitment to your unit, and life-saving efforts on the battlefield were brought to our attention by your former commanding officer, Captain R. Hanley. Though previously overlooked due to procedural oversight, your bravery is now receiving the formal recognition it deserves. Asterisk, James stopped reading. His chest tightened. His breath caught. He remembered Operation Iron Ridge with brutal clarity. The ambush, the smoke, the screaming over the radios. He remembered dragging 2 men to safety with shrapnel burning in his thigh and no cover for 100 yards. He remembered not thinking, just moving. And afterward, the long silence. No ceremony, no medals. Just dust and a long flight home. He had never spoken of that day. Not once. Not to the VA counselors. Not to Lily. Not to anyone at the ranch. Now, here, it was named, acknowledged, validated in words that felt almost too distant to be real. James folded the letter, set it on his nightstand, and sat in the quiet. For the first time in years, he let the emotion come. Not tears, those had dried long ago, but a slow, deep release. As if a weight he'd carried for so long had shifted ever so slightly. The next morning, he went back to work like always. No announcement, no story. He didn't want fanfare. Didn't trust it, but Lily knew, and so did Hal. Eventually, the letter was addressed to the ranch office, to a copy, sent for verification. Hal had opened it, read it in silence, and said nothing for the rest of the day. That evening, as James checked the tack room, Hal walked in and leaned on the doorway. "I read the letter," he said simply. James nodded. "Didn't think they'd ever remember," Hal shrugged. "Well, they did, and now we know too." There was a pause. "You should tell the others," Hal added. James shook his head, not looking for attention. Hal studied him. "Doesn't matter what you're looking for, it matters what they see. And maybe it's time they see something more than what they think they know." James didn't respond, but something inside him stirred. Not pride, not vindication. Just a sense that the silence might finally be giving way to something else. Word would spread, whether he told it or not, and what came next would be bigger than anything he expected. It started quietly, just a whisper passed around the breakfast table. A copy of the letter, somehow, had ended up pinned to the corkboard in the ranch's main office. Maybe Hal had done it without a word, or maybe Lily, quietly proud, had found a way to share it without betraying James' privacy. Either way, by the following morning, everyone on the ranch knew. For a long time, the men didn't know what to say. The younger hands, who had once snickered behind James' back, Sergeant Slow, they called him now, sat stiffly at meals, their jokes hollow, their glances heavier with guilt. Kyle, in particular, seemed to shrink into himself. He no longer puffed out his chest when he passed James in the yard. He started working longer hours, kept his head down, and stopped talking over others during meetings. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. James didn't change. Not outwardly. He still rose before dawn, fed the horses, repaired the fences, and rode the pasture with the same quiet efficiency. But there was a subtle difference, a certain stillness in how he held himself. His shoulders seemed a little straighter, his steps more grounded. He didn't smile. James wasn't a man who smiled much, but there was a calm in his silence now. Instead of a storm, then, a week later, came the phone call that changed everything. Lily answered it in the kitchen, her hands still flour-dusted from rolling biscuits. She listened quietly, asked them to hold, and walked out to the barn, where James was shoeing a horse in the shade. "It's the Army," she said simply. "They want to talk to you. Something about a ceremony." James straightened, brushing the dust from his knees. "Ceremony," she nodded. "In D.C., big one. Apparently they don't hand out the Distinguished Service Cross in the mail." He sighed. The idea of travel, of standing in a room full of officers and flashbulbs, Felt like something from another lifetime, another version of himself he wasn't sure he could access anymore. Do I have to go? No, Lily said, but maybe you should. That night, he sat alone again. The invitation letter laid flat on his bunk. It was formal, crisp, and impersonal. And yet, in every clean line of type, he felt the weight of something long overdue. He thought about the night in the desert when the ambush hit, the chaos, the blood, the two soldiers Thompson and Diaz who wouldn't have survived if he hadn't moved. He thought about how little those moments had meant to anyone once they got home, how no one had asked him what it cost to keep breathing. Now, they were asking. By morning, his decision was made. When he told Hal and Lily, they simply nodded. When he told the rest of the crew at breakfast, the room fell quiet. No applause, no cheers, just a long, respectful silence. It was Kyle who finally stood. I was wrong about you, he said, voice low. I'm sorry. James met his eyes. I know. Nothing more needed to be said. The ranch helped arrange the trip. Lee packed him a bag. Hal offered to cover his duties, and one of the ranch hands drove him to the airport in Lubbock. As James left, the crew stood in the yard, not in uniform, not in formation, but in a straight line, hats in hand. They didn't say much. They didn't have to, because they finally understood. James wasn't just a man who had been broken and discarded. He was a man who had survived things most of them would never comprehend. A man who carried the scars of service not on his sleeve, but in the silence he wore like armor. And now, the world beyond the ranch was about to see it too. The day of the ceremony arrived with the kind of crisp, cloudless sky that photographers dream about. Washington, D.C., was bright with sunlight and bursting with summer heat. But the mood on the Capitol lawn was solemn, respectful, and humming with quiet anticipation. Rows of folding chairs lined the freshly cut grass. A polished podium stood beneath the Army's insignia, and the American flag swayed in the breeze with slow, rhythmic grace. James Dalton stood near the back, watching silently. He wore his full dress uniform, the same one that had gathered dust in his closet for over a decade. It still fit, mostly. The rows of ribbons on his chest seemed strange, almost foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. His posture was straight, his eyes clear, but he felt like a man watching someone else's life unfold. Around him were families of other honorees, soldiers in uniform, officers and generals, even a few politicians shaking hands in the background. There were television cameras set up, a few reporters with notepads, and a scattering of military historians murmuring about record corrections and retroactive honors. James felt out of place. Always had. And yet, when they called his name, Staff Sergeant James Dalton, U.S. Army, retired, he walked forward with the same calm, quiet determination that had carried him through war, recovery, and ranch life. A colonel greeted him at the podium. Sergeant Dalton, he began, this recognition has been too long in coming. Your actions on the battlefield were nothing short of heroic. But it is not only for the lives you saved that we honor you, is for the example you set, then and now. He pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on James's chest with careful, practiced hands. The medal was heavy physically and symbolically. For a second, James stared at it, unsure what to feel. Then he stepped back, faced the crowd, and stood at attention as the national anthem played. Somewhere in the front row, he noticed Captain Hanley, his former CO, older now, grayer, but unmistakable. The man nodded once, and James returned the gesture. No words needed. They both knew what that day in the desert had cost. When it was James's turn to speak, he didn't go to the podium right away. He hesitated. Speaking had never been his strength, but he owed something not to the crowd, not even to himself, but to the men who hadn't come home. He stepped up, adjusted the mic, and cleared his throat. I don't talk much, he began. A few people chuckled quietly, so I'll keep this short. He looked out over the sea of faces. I didn't come here for a medal. I came here to remember, to remind all of us that sometimes the ones who go quiet after war are the ones who still hear it every day. That honor isn't in the ceremony, it's in the showing up, the holding on, the not quitting when it gets hard. That's what I've tried to do. He paused, let the silence hang. This means a lot, he added, glancing at the medal, but it doesn't belong to just me. And with that, he stepped down. The crowd stood, not because they were told to, but because they felt it. It was not the speech of a polished officer or a practiced politician. It was the voice of a soldier, real, unpolished, and raw. Afterward, people came to shake his hand. Veterans hugged him. Young soldiers asked for photos. A mother with tears in her eyes whispered that her son had died in Operation Iron Ridge, and James held her hand, silently grieving with her. For once, James let it happen. He let the handshakes come, let the questions roll off him, let the world see who he was, no longer hidden in the background or dismissed as damaged. Because on that day, for the first time since he'd come home, he wasn't invisible. He was seen. When James returned to the ranch, it wasn't with a hero's parade. He didn't want one. No banners, no speeches, no photographs. Just the same two-lane road, winding through the Texas hills. The same clouds dragging shadows across the open. fields, and the same red dust clinging to the edges of his boots. But something had changed. This time, the silence that welcomed him didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Hal was waiting at the gate when the old pickup dropped him off. He nodded, didn't say much, just took James's bag and gave him a long look that said more than any words ever could. Behind him, Lily stood on the porch of the main house, wiping her hands on a dish towel, a warm, proud smile on her face. The other ranch hands gathered near the barn. They didn't cheer, they didn't clap, but they stood up straight, hats in hand, and waited for James to walk past. One by one, they stepped forward, Kyle included, and offered a handshake. Simple, respectful, honest. James shook each hand, looked each man in the eye, not as a soldier, not as someone who needed to prove anything, but as someone who had finally been seen for who he was. For the first time, they weren't just acknowledging what he had done in the army. They were acknowledging the man he had always been right there on the ranch, a man of discipline, grit, and quiet loyalty. Life resumed. But not quite as before. Kyle started riding with James on fence checks, asking questions instead of giving orders. He started listening. A few of the younger hands began calling him Sergeant without a trace of sarcasm. It stuck not as a joke, but as a sign of respect. Even Hal started using it when something needed fixing. Sergeant, you mind giving this a look? James didn't correct them. Lily noticed the difference in him most. He came in for coffee more often now. Sometimes even stayed to chat, short conversations, but conversations nonetheless. Once, he even asked her about her late husband. She answered softly, and they sat in companionable silence as the kettle hissed and whistled. James didn't become a different man, but he became a more open one, and that mattered. Weeks passed, then months. The medal stayed tucked away in a small wooden box on the shelf above his bunk. He didn't display it. He didn't bring it up. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he would take it out and hold it in his hands, feel the weight of it. The cold of the medal, the etching of his name, not as a reminder of war, but as proof that the pain, the sacrifice, and the years of silence had not been in vain. One evening in late fall, James was watching the sun dip behind the hills when a boy from town rode up the gravel drive. He was about 18, wearing a faded RAC shirt, nervous and sweaty. He took off his cap and approached James with hesitation. "Sir, Sergeant Dalton," he asked. "They told me you might be willing to talk to someone about enlisting." James studied him for a moment. "Sit down," he said, pointing to the porch steps. They talked for nearly an hour about duty, about fear, about the difference between wanting to fight and wanting to serve. James didn't glorify war. He didn't scare the boy either. He just told the truth, clear and simple. When the boy left, his eyes were different, wiser, steadier. James watched him go, then turned back to the sunset, the sky now burning gold and orange across the horizon. He thought of the road he'd traveled, from war zones to broken bones, from humiliation at the ranch to standing in front of generals. He thought of the silence that had once been his shield, and he realized something. He had made it through. Not by shouting, not by demanding recognition, but by living with integrity, every single day. And in the end, the world had caught up. The army had honored him. The ranch had respected him. And maybe, most importantly, he had learned to honor himself again.